students. We really appreciate it. And we're going to get started with the recording now. But yeah, we have some great panelists from lots of different organizations and different types of experiences that we're really excited for you guys to hear from. Yeah, and just an introduction of myself. My name is Kirstina. I'm a career peer educator, or CPE, at the Career Center, which just means that I'm an undergrad student and I work on different programs for the Career Center. And Kylie and I will be running the show today. Kylie, do you want to introduce yourself really quick?
Yeah, so I'm Kylie. I'm currently finishing up my master's in higher ed at the education school and serving as a graduate intern for the public service and government team. And I get to work with Christina and organize the panelists. So thank you all again for joining.
Yeah, awesome. So just an overview of how things will go for today. We'll kind of get things started by introducing our panelists. We have some questions planned for them. And we'll save about 10 or 15 minutes at the end for your questions that you have that can either be similar to the ones that you sent when you registered, or if things come up during the panel as our panelists start answering, feel free to send in questions. If you have questions that come up, feel free to chat them directly to Kylie, and she'll be keeping track of questions throughout, or you can feel free to unmute yourself and speak up when we get to the student questions portion. That's kind of how things will run for today, and we'll go ahead and get started. So first, could we just have our panelists each introduce themselves? We'll get kind of basic info, just your name, your position at your organization, brief background on what your organization does, your year and major at UVA, and just for fun, maybe a favorite class that you took at UVA. So Sarah, you are first on my screen. Would you mind getting us started?
Sure. So my name is Sarah Rupert. I am a program associate at SITE, which is the Center for International Private Enterprise. I work on their MENA team, specifically on the North Africa side of that, so Morocco and Tunisia. I majored in foreign affairs and French at UVA, and I graduated in 2018. And a favorite class that I took was a French class on Joan of Arc.
Nice, that sounds very cool. Let's hear from Juliana. You're next on my screen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Juliana Parra. I am a research associate at EAB on the K-12 short-term team. EAB is a best practice research firm headquartered in Washington, D.C., which is very convenient since I live in Northern Virginia, and it's currently where I'm located. I virtually graduated last year. Shout out to class 2020. And I majored in youth and social innovation and American studies. One of my favorite courses, which is going to seem a bit like a plug because I TA'd the course, was Introduction to Adolescence by Professor Smith.
Very nice. Let's hear from Moises.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Moises Mendoza. I am an Algebra 2 teacher with KIPP Texas Public Schools. KIPP is a national charter school system. I graduated from UVA in 2019 as a youth and social innovations major. And favorite class, there's a lot of good ones, but I think I'd have to go with designing games in education. I think that's what it's called. I don't know the title specifically, but we designed games in education. That was lots of fun.
Awesome, thank you. And Priya.
Hi, everyone. My name is Priya Malhotra, and I'm currently a senior product manager at EAB, just like Juliana. So you made my job a little bit easier. I already described EAB, which, just like she said, is the best practicing consulting, technology, and research firm based out of DC. I'm actually working remotely for the company, so I'm currently based out of Chicago. My major was religious studies. I graduated in 2015. And if I remember correctly, my favorite course was global social entrepreneurship. I don't remember the professor, unfortunately, but it was a great class where we delved into case studies from different entrepreneurs around the world to understand, why their nonprofits and businesses were or were not succeeding. So it was just a really helpful and great thing to be part of.
Very cool. Thanks. And let's hear from Erin.
Hi there, my name is Erin Garrett. I am a manager for advocacy at an organization called Education Forward DC, which, as the name suggests, is located in Washington, DC. It's a grant-making organization serving various K-12 ed organizations, everything from charter schools to various charities in the city. And there I work on some of our advocacy portfolio, particularly as they pertain to facilities work for our public schools in the city. I graduated from the university in 2011. I was a sociology major, and 2011 was kind of a long time ago. So I'm not sure I have a great answer for best class anymore. I'm not sure any of my professors are still around. But I really enjoyed something that was offered through the Curry School back then called multicultural education. Okay, I see people nodding. That was a good one. People know about that. I took it as a third year and then was one of the facilitators my fourth year. And it was, I think, equally important then as it is now. And it was something that really sparked my interest in education, helped me when I became a teacher, following final exercises.
Yeah, we definitely got some nods from that class, so some consensus there. Let's hear from Rachel.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Capel, and I currently work as a senior research analyst at NORC at the University of Chicago out of their Bethesda office. The headquarters is in Chicago, but their second largest office is in Bethesda, so that's where I'm located. NORC is a nonpartisan research organization, so we help clients like federal agencies, corporate businesses, nonprofit partners answer their research questions with data and analysis. I was a youth and social innovation major and a sociology minor. I graduated in 2016, and my favorite class was not in Curry, but it was Books Behind Bars. And I don't know if anyone else took it, but we got to have conversations with juvenile inmates about Russian literature. So it was a really unique experience while I was at UVA.
Very cool, thank you. And Jackie.
Sorry about that. Hi, my name is Jackie Chevalier Mosley. My husband's running late, so I have my child here. This is Fletcher. I graduated from UVA in 2006. Do not ask me what my favorite class was. I have no recollection. I'm also pregnant with my second kid, so mom brain is real. I was a sociology and philosophy major, and I am currently the director of government relations for Nelnet. If anybody here has student loans, you may have Nelnet as a servicer of your federal student loans. I just left the House Committee on Education and Labor, where I was the director of education policy. I was there for 8 years. So I was over, actually, my background's in K-12. So K-12 policy was what I spent most of my time doing. But Nelnet is a kind of a diversified company with a large student loan presence. We actually also own Great Lakes, which is another servicer. So that's what I do now from home in the DC area.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here today. We really appreciate it again. Yeah, and so next we'd like to hear a little bit more about each of your current positions. If you could tell us kind of about what you're doing now or any previous position related to education and youth development, kind of what that was like in the day-to-day, yeah, and just what that looked like for you. Juliana, would you mind getting us started?
Sure. So yeah, very much in the youth and development area as a K-12 research associate. My day-to-day looks like responding to district questions from anyone at the higher leadership level, administrators, superintendents, et cetera, just with any sort of questions that have to do with the challenges that are affecting youth and school systems at large. So a lot of that, as I'm sure you can assume, has to do with COVID and in-person classes, whether or not to go back in, a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And it's just a matter of responding to their questions at hand, trying to get those out between 5 to 10 days. And the other part of my job is presenting custom reports to these school districts about bigger questions that they might have, those that take a little bit more between the 4 to 6 week mark. They include interviews, a longer report, and I just wrapped one up on preventing and addressing cyberbullying. So that was really cool. So yeah, a lot of the work is research, as the name implies, and it is really interesting to kind of serve directly, in a sense, to really helping out schools with their pressing questions about really how to help youth thrive and help teachers thrive in their academic settings, and just kind of be able to use that work. It's obviously remote, so a lot of it is just online and writing those reports. And I have a small team, so that's really cool that we can kind of collaborate with each other as well. So that's kind of the day-to-day.
Awesome. And maybe we could hear from Priya, since you're also in a different role at EAB, and then after that, panelists, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, sure thing. So as I mentioned previously, I'm actually on the product management side, which means that I'm working for our technology arm. And so my day-to-day is actually thinking about the products that we provide to institutions of higher ed. So working with colleges and universities to understand what sort of information do students need at their fingertips, in order to make sure that they are doing the tasks that they need to be doing on time in order to persist and ultimately graduate. And then on the staff side, creating and updating data and technology to make sure that advisors and other staff can keep track of those things. So in the weeds of data analytics, as well as just thinking about what is top of mind today. Right now, we're working on a survey tool as well as a financial planner. As you can imagine, those are two concerns that have historically been top of mind for students, but I think especially because of COVID have been amplified. So a lot of what we're doing is, making sure that within the technologies, we are, for instance, not perpetuating implicit biases that people might have, right? And while you're working in that technology, making sure that every student can access the technology in an accessible way, in a helpful way, right? So there's a lot of user design elements. And then of course, taking into account more of the technical component. So what can we actually deliver from an engineering standpoint that's sort of consistent and reliable for colleges and universities. So a lot of interviewing on my side, a lot of student focus groups, which are a ton of fun, and then ultimately taking that back with our internal teams, just to make sure that we're creating product roadmaps, which just means enhancing our products and creating new features for our products that are actually going to be helpful to schools and to the students that are attending those schools.
So I currently work in public health, actually. So maybe not seemingly super related to youth and education, but it is. So when I graduated from UVA, I worked at Children's National Medical Center in DC as a research assistant on a mental health care coordination study for adolescents specifically. So I was helping enroll them in the study, collecting follow-up data, and conducting surveys with adolescents and things like that. And I loved it. And I think care coordination is a very valuable tool for mental health care for adolescents. But I felt like there were a lot of more macro level issues that needed to be addressed to support these DC youth in overall health and well-being. So I ended up pursuing my master's in public health. And now I'm working in public health, still with an interest in youth. And one of my favorite projects that I'm working on right now is for the Office of Minority Health. And we're providing technical assistance for grantees who have been awarded funds to provide tax preparation support to help families apply for the earned income tax credit. And then following up to see if that affects adverse childhood experiences in the long term. So the research shows that, financial stability can decrease ACEs. So it's just really fun supporting them in their evaluation efforts, and hopefully they'll be able to show that it works. So I'm still really passionate about the youth work I do in the public health field.
My day-to-day is a little bit different. My current role focuses less on youth development than some of my previous roles. So I previously was a youth development specialist with the Peace Corps in Morocco, where my day-to-day was collaborating with local organizations and government officials to develop programs and trainings, and then also was designing and teaching English, life skills, and sports classes to students. And prior to that, I worked for Sister Cities International as their youth programs assistant, which was much more focused on organizing large-scale events for youth. My current role, I'm working kind of on more behind the scenes stuff that isn't so much related to youth development, but in those two previous roles, one of the best things was getting to work directly with students and with youth. And so that was some of my favorite parts of those jobs.
I can go next. I mean, I can tell you what I do in my current job. It's really not that interesting. I lobby members of Congress and run a PAC. I think correct me if I'm wrong, but I think why you originally found me was my old job, which is far more interesting than my current job. So in my old job, I was director of ed for the House committee. I started, we were in the minority, and then when the House flipped in 2018, obviously Democrats took the majority, and so then was in the majority. So we had jurisdiction over everything from childcare to workforce development, with a pretty big focus on K-12 and on higher education. So any amendment to the Higher Education Act, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, Head Start, CCDBG, all that stuff went through our committee. I spent a lot of time negotiating, both with Republicans, but also with the Senate and with Democrats, including other Democrats on committee. So you're kind of, the chair gets to set the agenda, and then I manage the staff. We had a policy staff of about 11, so working just on education. And the way that it works on committee, or the way that it works in Congress, especially in the House, each House office is pretty small. So you have like 3 or 4 legislative staff covering the entirety of all things in the federal government and beyond. And so like most staff, even staff of members who are on the committee, like don't really know anything. So it was, about, specific policies. It was not uncommon to get like an email from somebody being like, is there a law for special education? Like, do we provide services for kids? And it's like, yes, we do. Here it is, right? So it was our job to kind of be the eyes and ears and think tank on education issues for the caucus. Before I was director, I was the lead negotiator on a bunch of stuff, including the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is a terrible law, but because it hasn't been implemented well. But if anybody here cares to talk about it, I am happy to extol the benefits of No Child Left Behind, but it's for another conversation.
I can jump in. Like Jackie, I've had a bunch of different roles in education, all in K-12, but have sort of been at various levels. So focusing sort of primarily in my time as a teacher on super micro level, working with students as a 4th grade educator in Delaware. I've had experience in higher ed. I worked briefly in alumni affairs at George Washington University, but the siren song of younger children kept calling back. So I've spent the bulk of my career in K-12 ed and have done everything from teacher advocacy, managing a teacher advocacy program here in DC for an organization called Teach Plus. I've worked in DC government twice, once for the deputy mayor of education, since DC is a city with mayoral control of its education, or its system of education delegated to proxy via the deputy mayor. Worked for the deputy mayor for education, as well as for the SEA, the state education agency. So while DC is not a state, we have a state education agency that functions as a pass-through for a lot of the federal funding that Jackie, I'm sure, knows a great deal about and had a great deal of influence in helping to hammer out. So I worked for the Office of the Chief of Staff for the Office of the State Superintendent of Education in DC for 3 years, and most currently work on advocacy issues here in DC. So what that looks like day to day is essentially making sure that all of these different other systems that exist in the city, so whether it's the roughly 50% of students who attend a DC public school, so the traditional public school sector, or the roughly 50% of public school students who attend a public charter school, also receiving public education, that the LEAs, the local education agencies, whether that's a school district like DCPS or a KIP like Moises works for, making sure that those organizations, that parent voice organizations, that all of these various stakeholders have the environment they need on the ground to succeed. So working with council, working with various governmental organizations to make sure that the environment that we have here in DC is right for and continues fostering the amount of growth that we've seen over the past, 15 years here in the city.
My day today is pretty simple to understand, I would say. Just teaching kids algebra 2. But I think what I would add to that is your day if you are interested in teaching, your day to day will probably look very different depending on type of program you're at. Like KIP is a very yeah, that's true. But like KIP is a very specific program to the population we're serving, or how we even implement our curriculum, right? And so if you go to a private school or public school, depending what program you're at, your day to day, even though you're a teacher and maybe you are teaching the same content as somebody else, will probably look a lot different, right? So I know at KIP, there's a ton of meetings within our class period. So I'm in one-on-ones with my supervisor, or we're having like all content team meetings like on a constant basis every week. And so I would say that teaching, isn't always just like, oh, go in the classroom, prepare your lesson plan and execute it. There's a lot more to it. Before teaching, I also worked in higher ed. So I worked in advising first year college students in Texas specifically. So advised students all over Texas in kind of matriculating into their second year and making sure they didn't drop out. And so KIP has a 2-system kind of network right now, where we have our K through 12 system, and we also have a system called KIP through college that is fairly new, not super new, but they implemented this new program specifically because our mission, KIP's mission, if you're familiar with the public charter school system, was to get this underrepresented students to and through college. And something they noticed was you're getting a lot of our kids to college, but that through piece is falling. And what's why are we doing the work that we're doing if we're falling short on that through piece? So I started the through college department, and so I worked in higher ed before teaching. And advising our students and making sure that they still had the support once they graduated our system. So if you're interested in that, I can also speak on that topic.
Awesome, thank you. And next, we're hoping to hear about some of the impacts of the work that you do. So either at the micro level or kind of the larger macro level. And if you're involved in like research or government, some of our panelists are like, have you seen the impacts in school practices, things like that, really anywhere you want to take it? Let's see, Erin, would you mind starting us off, and then we can hear from a few others as well?
Sure. So one thing that I've experienced throughout my career is sort of the push and pull or tension between wanting to find a job that I find intrinsically rewarding in education, which is, what draws me to it is helping students and making sure, particularly here in DC, that every kid has the ability to attend a really great public school. And that's really evident when you're, a classroom teacher. Like at the end of the day, I could go home and say, Michaela was not like, her A times tables were not sticking today. Like I was not hitting it. And tomorrow I need to try something else. I need to tweak my lesson plan. I need to take a look at what I'm doing and retool. And I think what's been hard ever since I left the classroom is sort of like chasing that same high, where in one of my roles, I worked in implementation of the law that Jackie mentioned, the Every Student Succeeds Act. So I would go around the country and help different state superintendents of education write these state plans. So the Senate passed this law. There's tons and tons of, it ends up being a 50+ page plan for each.
I got to point that out, not just the Senate, co-equal branches.
Yes. So after being passed or enacted into law, every state had to write up a plan saying, here's A through double X of like all of the things that the government says we need to implement as a state, covering everything from workforce development to special education to, you know, serving English language learners. And what I found really gratifying about that was getting to travel around the country and meet with folks in very different states whose state systems have sort of very different contexts to navigate, and helping those folks to really impact the way their schools and their teachers were going to be teaching and how their students were going to be learning for the next, you know, however long. And having that kind of responsibility, super, I guess, daunting, but also a way that I think I find it harder to sort of see impact in a role like that, just from a personal standpoint, because it is such a, it's hard to imagine, you know, like 8 different states with millions of students across all of them, and thinking about how one's work affects all of those students. For me, I think the sweet spot is where I am now in DC, either working as I did in my most recent role for the State Education Agency, where we're a city with, you know, 90 some thousand public students. I think that is the right sort of scale for seeing impact and seeing the fruits of the labor that I do every day play out on a scale that is manageable and meaningful to me.
Jackie, would you care to add anything about kind of impacts at the macro kind of policy level?
Yeah, I mean, the thing, like, of course there are, you know, federal law is federal law. So like the lead up to ESEA reauthorization the last time, which is ESSA, which is a set of amendments to ESEA, the big fight, which is now the same fight that's happening right now, is about assessments and whether or not we should have statewide assessments. And if anybody here doesn't think we need them, I will fight you to the death. But objective achievement data is needed to hold the system accountable. But, you know, so like in those debates, right, like the federal government could have reauthorized a law that took away the testing requirement, but we didn't. So we kept it, right? So there's a very obvious impact, right? Like everybody hates me because we still have tests. And that was something that, you know, my boss, I work for Bobby Scott, member of CDC, member of KPAC. It was very important to the civil rights community that we maintain objective achievement data across states, across a state. But, you know, so that's one impact, but it is harder. Like you don't really see at the classroom level, you don't really necessarily see the impact, and we probably shouldn't, right? Because if we're doing our job correctly, and everybody, you know, bemoan No Child Left Behind for being this terrible, terrible law, but it's really about how it's implemented. And federal law is here, like you start with the statute, and then you get federal regs, or if you're in a Republican administration, they report the regs, which is not good or helpful for anybody. But so you start with federal law, then you get federal regs, and you get state, you know, that overlaid with state law and state regulation, and then you get down to the local level, there's local procurement. Like, so there's tons of different layers before you get to a classroom teacher. And so when, you know, when we would always hear people come in and teachers would say, No Child Left Behind is the worst law ever. And it's like, explain to me what in your day-to-day practice, right, like you view as being the fault of No Child Left Behind. And most of the time it was BS, you know, other than, you know, the complaint of teaching to the test, right? What's measured is what gets measured gets attention, or whatever the saying is. But yeah, so in my current job, I would say my day-to-day impact. So I now work for a loan servicer. I work for a big corporation. Not what I thought I would be doing ever, but I view myself there as kind of a check to make sure that what we are doing is really in the best interest of borrowers. And I will say that the company I work for is actually really great. And you know, in working with FSA, that's the Student Aid Administration of the Department of Education, and yeah, I can say, like, without fail, every single decision that's made is with borrower interest in mind. It's a really, really complicated system. It's way too complicated. So, you know, working within the system to try and improve it. And, you know, like we're discussing now things like, you know, what's the point in interest capitalization, right? Which can put people further into debt when they go into forbearance and stuff like that. So having those kinds of conversations to improve equity, Lending's going to be around. People are going to borrow for higher ed. I paid for UVA with loans. And I'm sure some of you on the call did as well. But so yeah, that's my impact now.
I think this year has definitely made me look a little bit deeper in terms of the impact that teachers are having on student life, and not just student life, but like a student's family's lives. Last year, so I taught last year as well, and it was an incredible experience, and you kind of go through the motions. But I think this year more than ever, it was kind of a pause to realize how important of a role we play in a kid's life. Just hearing about a lot of my students, especially the population we're serving, struggling so much because of the pandemic, whether it's financially or health wise, just breaks your heart sometimes. And trying to understand how to lead with an open heart in the classroom, while at the same time talking about these requirements, right? That I am required to teach certain things. I am pushed to try to meet certain standards, but my student's father just died, right? And it's and then this other family can't pay rent, or we just had a winter storm and a lot of homes were damaged in Texas. It's just these students don't even have internet, and how are we making sure that we are really trying to emphasize equity in our classroom and in our schools has been just very difficult. And it just reminds me that at the end of the day, a lot of these kids are coming to especially in KIPP where we have longer school days, a lot of these kids see me more time in a week than they see their parents, because they're starting school much earlier than public schools, and they're ending also a couple hours later than public schools. And so I think a lot of times, the work is very hard. I get home and I'm just holy crap, that was a lot. And coming back every day and just seeing the students, no matter what they're going through, trying to put their education as a priority, because they know that can really propel them forward and prepare their families forward, kind of keeps you going. But yeah, I don't know. I think this year more than ever has really put some emphasis in regards to the work that teachers are doing in and outside of the classroom. And I think for me also, just mentally, has made me try to prioritize mental health, both in the teacher side and student side. I think a lot of times we just expect things from students, oh, why didn't you do your work? Or oh, why is this missing? Why did you fail that test? You didn't try hard enough. And in reality, there's so much going on behind the scenes that I think our educators should think about before having to I guess make assumptions about a student performance. And so I don't know, I think that's some of the things that I've taken away in terms of the impact that's going on in the classroom specifically this year.
Yeah, Erin has made a couple of great comments in the chat about her teaching experience as well. And Moises, I think that is a great segue into our next question, which is how do equity and advocacy kind of play a role in the work that you do? Yeah, and I was hoping, Priya, could you get us started with that question?
Yeah, absolutely. I would actually very much just piggyback off of the same conversation, and how much COVID, I think, has unfortunately, I think, unveiled a lot of the inequities that already existed in our higher education system. But then I think the flip side of that is it also amplified the impact, and the impact that I was able to see in my current role, which was interesting. I think a lot of times working in technology can also feel a little bit jaded, right? And a little bit removed from the student impact itself, because it's a technology that is in the hands of the school that is then implemented to then be in the hands of students, right? So sometimes it feels well, what you're doing behind the scenes, is that actually helpful enough? Is that actually being used? And I think this was one of those moments in time where, a lot of the things that I think we take for granted, and students, well, you can just talk to your students and ask them that question. You don't need to have easy access to that data, or you can tell, right? You can talk to a student's professor and get information that way. You don't necessarily need to have all that information displayed in a place where you can find it very easily. And I think for the first time, it became essential to do that, right? Because you had students who weren't on campus for the first time, were virtual for the first time, didn't have access to laptops, right? Even other issues when we think about, living in food deserts. And there's just so many things to account for, especially when you're thinking about big systems like the California state system or the Houston system, and just the breadth of the cities and counties that those different colleges and systems cover. It's really accounting for a lot of those local inequities as well, right? So how do you actually make for education that is accessible and reasonable for a student who's living in, rural California, but then also living in Los Angeles, right? And how is the school system able to develop technologies that are able to flag where students might need different levels of support? I think we had a lot of really as much as we were able to see a lot of those inequities, I think at the same time hearing about the student was very easily able to tell us, I don't have somewhere to live right now, and I can't figure out how to get back home, but I don't know how to contact my advisor, and this is how I'm doing it to get that information. That was really heartwarming to hear that, we sort of were having that level of impact. I think maybe dissimilar to some of the other folks on the line, I'm definitely in the process of sort of still finding that sweet spot of scale, if you will. Prior to this, I was working for a college advising corps, so also very much in the classroom, working as a college counselor, and had that grassroots experience, which, just like everyone else has said, the impact is a lot more tangible every single day. And so I think still figuring out, is it one level in between technology and actually being in the classroom, or do you sort of move further away and look at it from a government or policy level? But I think sort of exploring different roles and different perspectives is an important part of that process.
I want to add something here. I know I just spoke, but with the college advisory corps, you probably saw this as well. I think in transitioning to the role I used to do for KIP in terms of advising our students in higher education, one of the things that I think is not as like clear, or maybe it is to some people, in terms of like equity in education and opportunities in education for different populations, is like social capital, and just like generational knowledge can be kind of like an invisible thing throughout the process of higher education. And something I saw a lot was a lot of the students we were serving at KIP, that they would graduate, they would apply to colleges, and they get their acceptance letters, and like to them, because they, a lot of I'd say like 90% of the students are first generation, and so they're like, oh, I got accepted, so they're just waiting for August to come around, and they think, they pack their backpacks and go to class. They have no idea that there's so much that goes into like enrolling into classes, or sending documents to FAFSA, and just all these like signatures that they have to submit, that can jeopardize them matriculating and actually like in their classes being dropped. And so they don't have a lot of this knowledge. They can't ask their parents, like, how do I go about signing this waiver? And they sound like very small things, but we had like hundreds of students who get dropped from their university simply because they didn't know they had a deadline to submit a form. And so I think when we're talking about equity, it's so important that we look at how social capital plays a role in a lot of the trajectory of students who might be minority or underrepresented populations. And so I think the work that College Advising Corps or all these institutions are doing is really important. Even when we're talking about policy, like, again, a lot of these families know nothing about the policies that are incorporated in regards to their own education and their students' education. So knowledge is just huge, and informing families about how a process works goes a long way. That's something that I think everyone, no matter what role you're in, you should really think about.
Yeah, I was hoping also we could hear from Rachel and maybe Juliana about how like research plays into advocacy as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think research is crucial to advocacy because often you need to show the data that you need your program or that your program works. You need to be able to prove that you're a valuable service to be able to get more funding. So rigorous research is super important for that. And, you know, for learning about populations that maybe haven't been included in research in the past, making sure access to research opportunities is equitable so they can be represented in the data that we're using to inform these policy and funding decisions is super important.
Yeah, I think I would add definitely an interesting part of my job is really seeing what schools are trying to focus on. You know, what do they realize are the gaps at their school districts, what's missing in the classroom, what are families asking for, and a lot, like I mentioned, that the questions that we're getting have to do with social emotional learning. You know, how do we incorporate that in the classroom? How do we support our student and teacher mental health? How do we check in with our families? So it seems that because of kind of the stop that our world has been taking, a lot of teachers and schools are beginning to realize like there's a whole nother part to our students that is now coming extremely into light. How do we do it? So it's rewarding in that sense where you start, I mean, it can be a little bit redundant on our side, you know, getting the same question over and over again, but it's also showing the increase that it's becoming apparent that schools really need this, that districts need these tools and want these answers because they see it, that they see it's a necessity. So I find that really interesting when we continue to get kind of these big topic questions, and a lot of it is realizing now we're really focusing on the student and the teacher as a person and focusing more on their needs as a person before kind of as a student or as a teacher to really make sure that their needs are taken care of first before being able to actually succeed in the classroom. They need to be there fully and they need to be supported just given the world that we're living in. Hopefully this kind of continues on even as we start stepping away from COVID, who knows when, but just kind of really realizing how important it is to check in and to be there and to focus on the student as a whole. So that's kind of where research plays in, and our part is, you know, kind of seeing the continuum of need. And then the cool thing about EAB is, you know, you start getting the same questions over and over again. You're like, all right, so we need to dig further. We need to come up with a toolkit. We need to come up with a product that really helps everyone at the whole level. So it's just kind of that continuum of, you know, seeing the need and being able to address that need.
Yeah, and then before we move on, I know, Erin, you've had a lot of different positions related to advocacy. How does equity play a role in the work that you've done?
I would say that to me personally, both this concept of equity and making sure that things are not just equal, but actually righting historic wrongs for some of the students in our country that have been, whose communities have been most deeply affected by our historical trajectory to injustice has been central. But also I find it's, at least in the organizations I've worked in, been a pretty central part of the mission or ethos, or like the sort of the job description. So in my current role, one of the things that we are doing, since the organization functions sort of as in funds, so raising money, raising capital in order to provide that capital to other organizations via grants, as we consider what we should do in our next fund or next set of money. One of the things we've been doing is thinking really intentionally about how our grantees and how the priorities we fund and how the work we do can be leveraged to combat anti-Black racism, particularly in a city like Washington, which is a historically Black city, how we can use our capital, both social and financial, to fund the organizations and folks in the city who are on the ground doing the work that help to dismantle some of those systems of injustice. And what I find particularly gratifying about that is the fact that I think a lot of times, having worked for nonprofits or various organizations in ed, there is a huge sort of philanthropic backbone to the work that a lot of folks in education do. And while that's great, and a lot of the things that have changed over the past decade, 15 years, have been catalyzed by the interest and generosity of rich folks, there is a certain tension between the generosity of rich white folks giving their money and directing the space in a way that they see fit. And as an organization that's focused on funding folks and causes in this city, in the District of Columbia, and working with the people who are on the ground, who are in these communities, who know the landscape, who know the context, and funding their priorities and putting money where what works is going, I think is something that's super important and helps to advance that notion of equity by putting resources in the hands of communities that need them most and have the best idea of how to use them.
Yeah, and before we move on to student questions, I did want to bring Sarah in, since she has had the unique experience of teaching abroad. And I was wondering, Sarah, if you could tell us about how your teaching experience affects the work that you do now.
Hi, yes, absolutely. Sorry, I've turned my video off because I'm having a little bit of an issue with the connection. But yeah, so as when I was a Peace Corps volunteer working in southern Morocco, equity and advocacy, that was a large part of the conversation, especially because I was coming into a community that I was not a part of. It was a multi-ethnic community. There was Amazigh, Arab, and Sahrawi students, and so very much listening before acting. And then in terms of how that has shaped the work that I do now with SIPE, that very much continues to play a role in the work that we're doing here, because we're implementing projects and programs in Morocco and in Tunisia and in Algeria. And we very much have to be listening first to the partners. They have to be the ones that are coming to us with the ideas about the programs that we're going to do. And then we're able to say, okay, well, this is our area of expertise, and these are your interests, and this is how we can maybe make something happen.
Awesome, thank you. And I want to make sure that we get time for student questions. And students, if there's a particular panelist that you might be interested in talking to more, Kylie and I can put our email addresses in the chat. You can feel free to reach out to us, and we can connect you to panelists if you're interested in continuing the conversation. But I want to make sure we cover our student questions. So Kylie, if there's any questions that have come up in the chat, or if students feel comfortable unmuting themselves and posing a question, that would be great.
I have not seen any in the chat currently, so please jump in if you're having any questions that are kind of coming up with some of what the panelists are saying or doing, and you want to follow up with them.
Yeah, I think Quentin raised their hand.
Yeah, one question I had is, I guess, how did y'all find the transition from like an entry-level education thing? So, for example, the research or the college advising corps into like the next step? Like, how did you find you were able to leverage those skills and like find those opportunities?
I mean, I can go. So I was supposed to go to law school. That was my plan. I was going to go straight from undergrad to law school, and then life happened and I didn't end up doing it. And I thought 5 years was a really long time. So, which is the time that you're all set good for. I was like, oh, I'll be good. I'll go in 5 years, and I never went. But so I actually started, my first job was in fundraising, and I actually didn't think I'd work in education. It's not that I didn't want to work in education, but it just wasn't something that I'd studied, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I thought I was going to be a public defender. And I ended up taking a job at a big nonprofit, and through a series of events kind of ended up doing education work there. And I treated it like graduate school. I decided, because, especially in DC, like a lot of people just want to like work on the Hill to work on the Hill. You know what I mean? Like they just want to like be around it, just be in an office, right? And I never really did. I wanted to find something that I really like doing, and I guess maybe eventually if I got to the Hill, like fine. But I was really concerned with that. And so once I had the education portfolio, I worked for United Way. And once I had the education portfolio, I was like, I'm going to learn everything there is about education. I bought a bunch of college textbooks. I was like, this is, I like school. I graduated with a high distinction from UVA. I've always liked, studying and, networking. And before I knew it, it was like I woke up and it was 8 years later, and I've been in nonprofits doing education related policy advocacy work, mostly focused around standards and accountability. In terms of, my mom gave me advice early on that was like, your job is what you make of it. And I think I've done that in every role, right? Like my first job, like I said, it was in fundraising, but I liked policy better. So I kind of just like started working on policy. And then they were like, oh, do you like policy? Do you want to do policy? I was like, yes, I do. Please put me over here. But I found that like being open, honest, admitting what you don't know, right? Like DC is full of people who want you to think that they know more than they do. Admitting what you don't know, and just like, and putting your head down and doing like good, like the thought work, like the workhorse work, goes a long way. And so, after 8 years in nonprofits, I got a call from the committee and they were like, hey, we've dealt with you in your roles at United Way and PTA. Like you've been helpful to us. Like, have you ever thought about working on the Hill? And so that's how I got to the Hill, which was not what I was planning on, but, and being nice to people. I would say, although some people probably do not say that I was nice to people in my old job, but I had to be mean to some people. They deserved it. Especially Republicans. No offense to anybody on this call who's a Republican, but yeah, so I don't know, stuff that anybody would tell you, right? Like just be nice, be a good person. People have long memories. Power is cyclical, all those things.
I think also the DC education world is super tiny. It's so like I've been out of college for 10 years and I've had 4 or 5 jobs in DC or fellowship opportunities, et cetera. And I keep running into the same people going from think tank world to nonprofit world, from the Hill to consulting world and back again. And I cannot overstate the importance of like building your own brand, but not building your own brand in a super self-aggrandizing way. What I mean by that is making yourself someone who is reliable and smart, like Jackie was saying, but also leveraging some of the connections you have, through UVA. I have both been the recipient of and taken the time out to talk to different students or connect with people just to find out more about what they do. And people are very, as this panel shows, very willing to talk about themselves, but also like be the helping hand that helps people to make connections. So I think like using your network and trying to just meet different people. And in the before times, there were, at events every single day with free pastries and coffee and going to things and passing out your business card and getting names is so helpful in just building a group of people and finding a mentor to help you along the way.
I think I would quickly add just to really know your own strengths and not to sell them short. I did a bunch of random things in undergrad, from working with professors on research to TAing to doing different things through Madison House, different organizations on grounds in general. And those are all skills that end up being super applicable in a professional job. I can speak as someone who truly just graduated and jumped into the professional world unknowingly. It was not my plan, but I was able to find a role that truly appreciated the skills that I had that maybe I didn't even know I had, and realizing how useful they can be, and just kind of having interests and having just a passion for education, a passion for equity, a passion for youth, and just like really being able to kind of learn on the on the fly. These are things that we're able to do kind of as students in different places that you put yourself in. Like honestly, being able to do online school and then having the ability to work a 9 to 5 virtually huge thing. Like, you know, these are just things that you don't really realize are going to be super important in the professional world, but end up being so. So you can kind of jump around into different things. I did a teaching fellowship 2 summers ago where I was in the classroom and then jumped into research. And those ended up being skills that I realized I could use, you know, time management, project management, communication. Those are all things that translate super effectively in the research world. So just like, don't sell yourself short in terms of the things that you've been involved in and the things that you want to do, because it ends up having a funny way of all working out when you find a career that you really are passionate about.
Yeah, those are great pieces of advice. And just out of respect for everyone's time, we're going to have to wrap it up for now. If any panelists are able to stick around for a few minutes, you certainly don't have to if you have other engagements, but if you're able to stick around for any lingering student questions, that would be great. And students, if you're hoping to get connected to anyone, feel free to email me. Jackie kindly put her email in the chat, so if you're hoping to reach out to her or anyone else, feel free to reach out to me. I can try and connect you all. But yeah, thank you all so much for coming, students and panelists. Can we get a round of applause or like virtual claps for our panelists? Yes, wonderful. Thank you all for coming.